Ukraine's president has confirmed a recent visit to the battlefront in the country's east. Volodymyr Zelensky awarded medals to soldiers there on the front line in the Oleksandrivsky sector. This year, Kiev's managed to stabilize the front, now dominated by swarms of drones, which have made swift troop movements almost impossible. All this coming at the same time as the head of the US intelligence was in Moscow. The Kremlin says CIA Chief John Ratcliffe didn't meet with Vladimir Putin. He had what were called contacts with Russia's special services. Putin was briefed. Moscow refused to confirm whether Ukraine was discussed or not. Let's hear from the Russian spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov.
All I can tell you is that there were contacts through intelligence services, and I can tell you that there were no meetings with the Russian president. However, it is still too early to say to what extent this will affect the overall process of bringing our bilateral relations out of the profound crisis they currently find themselves in.
Dmitry Peskov, spokesman for the Kremlin. Let's get more analysis and bring in Peter Zalmayev. Peter Zalmayev is the founder and director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, joining us live from Kiev. Peter, pleasure to have you on the programme, as always. Ukraine's long-range strikes this year have really, in many ways, changed the whole trajectory of the war.
Indeed, they have. By allowing Ukraine essentially to stay in this game, the game that is called, it takes two to tango, essentially, to all the Western detractors now, among them the well-known expert in Russia, Mark Galeotti. I have to single him out by name because he just came out with an article saying that, the West should stop indulging Ukraine in its unwarranted attacks on Russia's civilian infrastructure. There's a case to be made there, but then, who started this game, right? I don't think Vladimir Putin needed any excuses to be hitting or to have been hitting Ukraine's infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, ever since the war started for 4.5 years. Running with no pretext. Now, of course, the Russian side is using Ukraine's successful and ever deeper strikes into Russia's territory as justification for its campaign of vendetta. But once again, let's recall those instances, one after another, trade facilities, supermarkets, etc., malls throughout Ukraine being destroyed, 2022, 2023, and so on and so forth. Yes, it's a big question whether, Russia will, decide to wind down its war efforts simply because Ukraine's been able to hit some of its commercially, privately owned infrastructure. But once again, it raises the costs of this aggressive war of Russia overall, across the board. And also, in fact, is increasing, of course, societal tensions. You're already hearing on very tightly controlled federal TV channels some serious grumbling. Here and there, people are daring voice their displeasure at the government's inept response to what's happening, or it pretends that nothing, as a matter of fact, is happening when Russians can see with their own eyes that the war has come to them, finally.
And this is the aim that Ukraine has had in terms of the reach of the drone attacks. And from your perspective, one can see why this is clearly a good, positive thing. There are those objective observers who might say that this is Ukraine falling into the same category as the Russians now, carrying out attacks that could be, in some way, shape or form, characterized along the lines of a war crime.
Well, I mean, if we talk about the hits on the Ozon and Wildberry logistical hubs, I mean, they're the equivalent, Russia's equivalent of Amazon, just to put it kind of in simple terms. There's a case to be made, and Ukrainians have made that case. It's simply due to their size. They were also trafficking, so to speak, in dual-use parts that were used by the Russian army. It may be neither here nor there to make that argument. I think that, it's ultimately justified simply because it's a matter of justice. If Russia has been doing it to us ever since the start of the war, why can't Ukraine respond in kind? But then let's not forget that while this is happening, Ukraine is also concentrating on continuing its campaign against oil refining facilities, and that is actually hurting Russia where it matters the most. Russia is now a net importer of diesel and gasoline, which is unheard of for a major, oil producer such as the Russian Federation, is now importing oil from the likes of India. It is now planning to do the same with Kazakhstan and Belarus. You've all seen kilometer-long lines for gas throughout Russia. So yes, this is really hurting. This is where Ukraine should concentrate, in my opinion, its all its efforts. And of course, let's not forget, all these launch pads that have now been positioned close to Ukrainian borders, including a sizable number of North Korean ones, from what we hear. Ukraine is now thinking about how to take them out of operation. I think this is where we should concentrate our efforts. Not for lack of trying, especially considering that we have pretty much run out of air defense abilities, and that is really, really a troubling development, especially now that we're about to enter into our fifth now cold season of this war.
Indeed, 4.5 years is what it reaches this month. Of course, Vladimir Putin said it'll all be over in 3 days. Zelensky would be killed, Ukraine would be totally Russian. That never happened, it never looked like happening, given the response that Ukraine mounted and was able to sustain over this period. You're right, Peter, more air defences are needed. Vladimir Zelensky's had that message throughout the conflict. Andy Burnham of the UK has just been to promise more cooperation with Ukraine, but that promise doesn't become reality overnight, does it? It takes time to sort of get that technology, create those weapons that are on that promise sheet. I'm wondering where it goes next, because we've had the CIA in Moscow, with the head of the CIA speaking with the Russians. The Kremlin refusing to say that Ukraine has been the topic of conversation, but one wonders what else they've got to talk about.
This kind of brings us back to 2021 and Ratcliffe's predecessor, chief of CIA Burns' visit to Moscow as essentially Joe Biden's emissary to warn Moscow to stand down and not to entertain any overly adventurous plans vis-a-vis Ukraine. Well, we saw what that led to. That only whets Vladimir Putin's appetite, apparently. If there was any talk of winding down this war to allow, or at least putting it on a back burner, reaching some kind of a ceasefire agreement before the coming November elections in Congress, to allow Donald Trump and his fellow party members in Congress to have better prospects of maintaining control over the two chambers. Well, I think they have another thing coming. I don't think Vladimir Putin is ever, can ever be expected to sort of go along with that. When it comes to Ukraine, he remains as fixated as ever. And I think the Russians believe that any sort of pause would favor the Ukrainians. They're really, really reluctant to even discuss that. I'm of the opinion that most likely the Americans sought Russia's cooperation with Iran. Donald Trump very badly needs to wind this down before the elections in November. And we've heard persistent reports of Russia's, assistance to Iran with intelligence, etc. They probably want that to end. And so that may have been the main topic for conversation. I think it's still speculative. We don't have the details of that. But once again, I'm very skeptical that it would produce any major sort of changes when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war.
The one thing's certain, if the US put into the Ukraine defences what it's put into attacking Iran, the whole thing would be finished already, wouldn't it? Peter, thank you very much for joining us. As always, Peter Zalmayev, founder and director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, joining us live from Kiev. And Peter, do stay safe. Thank you for being with us.